The taste of copper filled my mouth before I even realized I was biting my lip. It was one of those windless autumn afternoons when the silence weighs heavy on everything, the kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder even when you know you're alone. I'm Dr. Elias Monroe, and I've been running this small-town veterinary clinic for 8 years now, long enough to know that certain calls come when you least expect them and change everything that follows. The phone had been silent all afternoon, which should have been a relief after the morning's rush of routine vaccinations and wellness checks. But there's something unsettling about too much quiet in a place that's usually filled with the sounds of healing, the soft whimpers of recovering animals, the gentle hum of medical equipment, the reassuring rhythm of life continuing despite injury and illness. When the call finally came, the woman's voice carried that particular strain I'd learned to recognize over the years: controlled panic, the sound of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. She'd found a stray dog behind the old train depot, she said, vomiting blood and in obvious distress. But what made me grab my keys immediately wasn't the medical emergency. It was what she said next. My 6-year-old daughter is the only one he'll let near him. She keeps saying he has a secret inside, that he swallowed something bad on purpose. I know how that sounds, but I didn't wait for her to finish the sentence. Before I tell you what I found inside that dog, I need to know something. Can you tell me in the comments where you're watching from? Your country, your city? Sometimes when I'm dealing with cases that challenge everything I thought I knew about veterinary medicine, I wonder if there are others out there who've encountered things that don't fit into any textbook or training manual. The train depot sits on the outskirts of town, a relic from decades past when freight lines still carried commerce through our forgotten corner of the world. The building has been abandoned for years, its windows boarded and weeds growing through cracks in the platform concrete. It's not the kind of place you'd expect to find a stray dog, especially one in medical distress. But there he was, lying on his side in the dirt beside the rusted tracks. A black shepherd mix, maybe 60 pounds, with ribs showing through thin fur and eyes that held an awareness I'd never seen in an animal before. Not the wild alertness of a feral dog, or the dull resignation of one that's given up, but something that looked almost purposeful. The woman who'd called me was standing nearby with her daughter, a small girl with dark hair who was crouched about 3 feet from the dog, speaking to him in whispers. When I approached, the child looked up at me with the kind of serious expression that sits strangely on such a young face. "He's been waiting for you," she said, with complete certainty. "He knew you would come." The dog barely moved when I lifted him into my truck, his body limp but his eyes never leaving my face. During the short drive back to the clinic, I could feel him watching me in the rearview mirror, and I had the strangest sense that he was measuring me somehow, deciding whether I could be trusted with whatever burden he was carrying. At the clinic, I followed standard emergency protocol: IV fluids to address dehydration, vitals monitoring, gentle sedation to manage what appeared to be significant abdominal pain. When I palpated his stomach, I immediately felt what was causing the obstruction: something hard, angular, definitely foreign. But the shape was wrong for the usual items dogs swallow, too geometric, too deliberately formed. My assistant Carrie helped me prep for emergency exploratory surgery. We'd done hundreds of foreign body removals over the years, everything from children's toys to jewelry to the occasional household item that dogs seem drawn to ingest. But as I positioned the unconscious animal on the surgical table and made the first incision, something felt different about this case. The moment my gloved fingers closed around the object inside his stomach, the overhead surgical lights flickered. Not the brief power fluctuation we sometimes get during storms, but a deliberate dimming and brightening that seemed to respond to my touch. Carrie stepped back, her eyes wide with confusion. What I pulled from that dog's stomach defied every assumption I had about what was possible. It was a cube, roughly 2 inches on each side, made from some kind of metal I'd never encountered. The surface was perfectly smooth, gunmetal gray, with no visible seams or joints to indicate how it had been manufactured. But what made my hands shake as I held it wasn't its impossible construction. It was the fact that it was still pulsing with its own rhythm, like a second heartbeat independent of any living tissue. One face of the cube was etched with a pattern that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Concentric circles surrounding what might have been an eye, or a portal, or something my mind couldn't quite process. And despite having just been removed from the acidic environment of a dog's stomach, The object was pristine, untouched by any biological process. I set it carefully in a surgical tray, and immediately the dog on the table let out a sound I'd never heard from any animal. Not a whine of pain, but something deeper, something that sounded like mourning. And if stories like this move your heart the way they move mine, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. Because what I discovered about this object would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the natural and the impossible. We completed the surgery successfully. Closing the incision and moving the dog, I'd started calling him Indigo for the strange blue glint in his eyes, to a recovery kennel. But the cube remained in my examination room, defying every attempt I made to understand it. It showed no response to magnets, generated no heat signature on thermal imaging, and seemed to exist outside the normal laws of physics that govern medical devices or biological implants. That night, for the first time in 12 years of operation, my clinic's security system failed completely. The cameras froze at exactly 3:12 a.m., the precise timestamp when I'd first brought Indigo through the front door. The timing felt too specific to be coincidental, too purposeful to be random equipment failure. But it was the sound that convinced me something fundamental had changed in my understanding of reality. Not an external noise, but something I felt in the bones of my inner ear, a humming frequency that seemed to resonate through my entire nervous system. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew stronger whenever I was near the cube. Over the next few days, as Indigo recovered from surgery, his behavior patterns became increasingly unusual. He refused to look at his reflection in any surface, turning his head sharply away from mirrors or metal examination tables that might show his image. He would bark frantically at analog clocks, but showed no response to digital timepieces. Most disturbing was his insistence that I be present during his meals. He would not eat a single bite unless I was standing within arm's reach of his kennel. But what convinced me that Indigo and the cube were connected in ways I couldn't understand was his response whenever the object was nearby. His pulse would spike, his breathing would become rapid and shallow, and he would position himself as close as possible to wherever I'd stored it. When I moved the cube to a locked cabinet in my office, Indigo lay beside that cabinet for 6 straight hours, not sleeping or pacing, just waiting with the patience of a sentinel. He wasn't afraid of the object. He was guarding it, or perhaps mourning its separation from him. 3 days after the surgery, a man arrived at my clinic in an unmarked sedan, well-dressed, soft-spoken, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that suggests government connections or corporate backing. He introduced himself as Dr. Morrison, claiming to represent a technology firm specializing in experimental nanomaterials research. "We've been tracking a prototype that went missing during transport," he explained, his voice professionally neutral. "Small, metallic, roughly cubic in shape. We have reason to believe it may have ended up in this area." When I asked how an experimental device could have ended up inside a stray dog in a town with no research facilities or major transport routes, he smiled pleasantly and didn't answer. Instead, he asked a question that made my blood run cold. "When you found it, did it hum?" I told him to leave immediately. That night I arrived at the clinic to find the front door standing wide open. Nothing had been stolen, but everything had been subtly rearranged. Medical supplies moved to different shelves, files reorganized in patterns I didn't recognize, equipment positioned as if someone had been conducting a detailed examination of my entire operation. Indigo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would shake uncontrollably at random intervals, staring into empty corners with dilated pupils and hackles raised. During one of these episodes, I placed my hand on his head in an attempt to comfort him, and something extraordinary happened. My vision blurred, and for a moment that felt like an eternity. I saw something that couldn't exist. A vast desert landscape under a sky the wrong color, with rows of dogs standing in perfect formation, all facing toward a tower in the distance that pulsed with the same rhythm as the cube. The vision was so vivid, so complete, that when it faded I was left gasping, uncertain whether I'd experienced a hallucination or been shown something real from a place I couldn't name. If you're feeling this moment the way I did when it happened, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. It means more than you know, because what I discovered next would convince me that some mysteries are bigger than any one person can solve alone. Sleep became impossible. I spent my nights searching through medical databases, classified patent applications, even fringe conspiracy forums, where people discussed encounters with unexplained technology. Nothing matched what I'd found inside Indigo, but in an obscure archive of digitized psychiatric journals from the 1940s, I discovered something that made my hands tremble as I read. In the margins of a case study about patients reporting technological implantation delusions, someone had drawn a small illustration in charcoal. A dog with glowing eyes and embedded in its chest, a perfect cube. Next to the drawing, in faded handwriting, were the words, "They return to the quiet places. They carry the memory. They know what we forgot." The drawing was identical to what I'd removed from Indigo's stomach, down to the pattern etched on its surface. As weeks passed, Indigo became increasingly attached to me. He followed me from room to room during the day, sat quietly beside me during surgeries with other animals, and every night before I left the clinic, he would place his paw on my chest and look directly into my eyes. There was something deliberate about these moments, something that felt like communication across a gap I couldn't bridge with words. But the strangest thing was how my own body began changing. The chronic shoulder pain I'd carried for years from long hours hunched over examination tables gradually disappeared. A slight tremor in my left hand that I'd attributed to too much coffee and not enough sleep simply vanished. I started dreaming of people I'd never met, but waking with complete knowledge of their names, their histories, their relationships to each other. The cube, now hidden behind layers of lead shielding in a locked safe, continued to pulse once each day at exactly 3:12 a.m. The rhythm never varied, never missed its appointed time, as if it was synchronized to some cosmic clock I couldn't perceive. Carrie eventually left the clinic, too unsettled by the unexplained phenomena to continue working there. The woman who'd found Indigo never returned my calls, and when I drove past the address she'd given me, I found an empty lot with no sign that a house had ever stood there. Then one morning I arrived at the clinic to find another visitor waiting by the front door. Another dog. Same breed, same size. Same strange blue glint in its eyes. Same subtle limp favoring its right side. When I examined this newcomer, the X-rays revealed a familiar shadow in its abdominal cavity. Another cube waiting to be discovered. Now I keep them both in the back wing of my clinic, away from the regular patient areas. Indigo and the newcomer, who I've named Echo for the way he seems to mirror every behavior pattern I observed in the first dog. They spend their days positioned near the safe, where I've hidden the original cube, maintaining their patient vigil with the dedication of guards protecting something sacred. I've stopped trying to understand what they are or where they came from. Logic and scientific method have brought me to the edge of a mystery too vast for conventional analysis. Instead, I've learned to listen. Late at night, when the clinic is quiet and the outside world feels far away, I sit with the dogs and focus on the frequency that hums through my bones. It's not random noise. It's pattern, structure, meaning encoded in ways my conscious mind can't decode, but my deeper awareness recognizes as communication. They're trying to tell me something, not in words, but in memory, in shared experience, in knowledge that transcends language. I know they're part of something older than machines, older than the technology we think we understand. Maybe a network that spans distances and dimensions we haven't learned to measure. Maybe a warning system alerting us to changes we're not yet equipped to perceive. Sometimes I wonder if I was chosen for this role, or if I simply happened to be in the right place when the universe needed someone to listen. But as I watch Indigo and Echo maintain their quiet watch, as I feel the cube pulse its steady rhythm through layers of shielding, I'm certain of one thing. This is just the beginning of something much larger than my small clinic, my limited understanding, my single perspective on mysteries that span generations. The memory they carry isn't just their own. It's ours, all of ours, waiting to be remembered by those willing to stop demanding answers and start learning to hear the questions. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it touched you, please subscribe, leave your comment below, and know how grateful I am for having you here. Because some discoveries change not just what we know about the world, but who we become in the process of learning. And sometimes the greatest courage isn't in solving mysteries, but in becoming worthy guardians of the questions they pose.